Good afternoon. My name is Michael Tipton. I'm the president of the Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Louisiana Foundation. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. As you all know, Blue Cross and the Blue Cross Foundation are committed to the health of the people of Louisiana. And as a result, we are always very proud to sponsor things that focus on movement in health. In our recent challenge grants on the foundation end, we focused on childhood obesity. And through research, it's no surprise to anyone in this room that we see again and again how moving naturally and consistently throughout the day can have a powerful effect on health. From New Orleans to Monroe, Baton Rouge to Lake Charles to Gina, these recent grants demonstrated how smart planning and building in ways that are conducive to this sort of movement can dramatically improve health and quality of life. And for this reason, among many others, we're glad to be here today to serve as a sponsor, and we look forward to partnering with you all in the years to come. Please feel free over the next day to find myself or my colleague Lydia Martin or Ben Mahoney if there are ways that we can be of support to you all. Now, to my primary task this afternoon, to introduce you to someone who, if you are from the Baton Rouge area, needs effectively no introduction, John Davies. John Davies has served the president and CEO of the Baton Rouge Area Foundation since June of 1988. The Baton Rouge Area Foundation is a community foundation that serves southern Louisiana. During the past 16 years, the foundation has collaborated to spark the revitalization of downtown Baton Rouge and revive neglected areas of the city. It's raised and granted more than $45 million for rebuilding a stronger South Louisiana after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. And after the Gulf of Mexico oil leak, the foundation made grants for more than $100 million, courtesy of BP, to deep water rig workers who were suffering financial hardship. Under John's leadership, the foundation recently created the Water Institute of the Gulf, a scientific institution responsible for generating unassailable science that will guide the restoration and protection of Louisiana's coast. During his 27-year tenure, the foundation has grown from a $5 million foundation to more than $550 million in assets. Over 50 years, the foundation has granted nearly $400 million to fund nonprofits and to pay for civic improvement projects. Son of a former U.S. diplomat, John spent his formative years in Lima, Peru. Please help me welcome John Davies.
Thank you, Michael. It's good to be here with all of you. First, I'd like to thank Peter and John Friganessa for the great work they did on the Louisiana Speaks project. Many of you will remember that post-Katrina, they came and gave coherence and structure to how, and not only that, but also hope, Peter, to how we in South Louisiana might rebuild our extraordinary place that we call home. It was a tour de force of work that has been extraordinarily useful as a pathway to today, 10 years after that event. Obviously, their success was inextricably linked to Boo Thomas and the great work that the Center for Planning Excellence did. So I wanted to recognize that, although it's not part of my formal comments. Peter Calthorpe is an extraordinary man. His original ideas and his dedication to implementing them are improving how we live now here and around the world. In 1984, Peter founded Calthorpe Associates. His urban design and architecture and landscape planning firm has been a pioneer of innovative approaches to urban revitalization, community planning, and regional design. Peter was among the founders of the Congress of the New Urbanism and served as the organization's first board president in the early 1990s. He offered the concept of transit-oriented development, an idea that is now the foundation of many regional policies and city plans around the world. His plans for Portland and Salt Lake City, Los Angeles demonstrate a more interactive approach to environmental design at the metropolitan scale. His latest book, Urbanism in the Age of Climate Change, documents his work relating to patterns of development, to energy and carbon emissions, along with other environmental, social, and economic impacts. Peter's 30-year practice has helped solidify a global trend toward these key principles of new urbanism, that successful places, whether neighborhoods, towns, urban districts, or metropolitan regions, must be diverse in uses and users, must be scaled to pedestrian and human interaction, and must be sustainable environmentally. Let me present to you Peter Calthorpe.
All right, 10 years. God, the time just flies. Some of you may have seen a little bit of this. I presented in the morning, but I will try to go over it very quickly now. I'm going to telescope out from Louisiana and even from the United States. I've been working for the last 8 years, mainly overseas. And the one thing that I've discovered is that the challenges that we're confronting here are global and shared. And that actually the fact that all these challenges are common, I think bind us together in really profound ways, ways that we don't always recognize or understand or realize that every building block that we put in place in our context actually helps the whole planet. You can think of climate change as the one thing that clearly unifies the planet. But actually every one of these challenges, well, except maybe for obesity, is global in its scale. Every city around the world has to cope with all these issues. So that's one thought to hold in your mind. The second, and regardless of income or location and history, so there's one unifying element. The other is that these things all intersect. They all intermesh and cohabitate in the domain of urban design and metropolitan planning. That actually the common solution is the most powerful solution. The single-pointed solution, the rifle shot, is never effective. But when we put these together, as I keep trying to do in many levels through my career, we see that the best solution to climate change involves affordable housing, involves better transportation, involves preserving open space, involves social equity across the planet, involves all these other things. And the fact that they all line up is tremendously powerful. And I spoke earlier today about how if anything is going to happen anywhere, it's always through coalition building. That there are special interest groups and politics everywhere that only move when they see a profound and new coalition, because the old coalitions have placed us right where we are, and change is never born of that context. And so building new coalitions, recognizing these commonalities, I think is what can be most powerful. Now, obviously, climate change has been incredibly divisive, both politically in the United States and also globally. And it's like everything else political, it's a matter of how you frame the issue. So the issue was framed in the way that said, well, China, this is a map of the world by carbon emission by country. And a lot of people said, well, if China's not in, then whatever we do isn't going to matter because they're actually the dominant source of climate change. So why should we act? But that is one way of framing the issue. If you look at it this way, which is tons of carbon per capita per year, who does what? And there's another slide I didn't put in, which has to do with the history of where all the carbon and climate change came from. But this one is particularly astounding. 23 tons per capita. That's us in the United States. In Europe, it's less than half. Actually, European rate, this is an old slide. I have to update it. I keep trying to update it. 10, it's now down to 7. When I first used this slide, China was 4 tons per capita. That was just 5 years ago. Now they're 7. This is not a really great progression. But it has to do with them moving people from poverty into the middle class and also being the factory for the planet. So actually, at this moment, on a per capita basis, China has overtaken Europe. So what does all that mean? It just means that, the question of pointing fingers and saying who needs to take responsibility here is really useless. It's a matter of how you frame it. But thinking about where and how this problem is caused is really key to the solution. Now, most of the climate change world is all fixated on renewables and conservation and technology. Technology is going to solve it. We're going to put collectors on our roof. We're going to have electric cars. We're going to put up solar collectors and wind farms. And, we don't change our life. We don't change our cities. we don't change our habits. We just get technology to backfill a different solution. But I don't think that's the best way, because it doesn't solve all the other problems. And only by joining hands with all the other problems are we going to get political momentum, if you follow my logic. So another way of looking at it isn't emissions by country or emissions per capita. It's where does the carbon come from? Globally, the average is 4.5, actually now it's 5 tons per capita, bad news. We've progressed from the 4.4, but close to over 2/3 of that carbon is coming from what I call urbanism, buildings and transportation. That's the entities that use the energy that creates this challenge. In California, and this pie chart is different all over the world, but it's always the same in that urbanism, the red and the orange, add up to the vast majority, the 800-pound gorilla in the room. So urbanism, the way we shape our cities and buildings, the way we move around our cities, that is what actually drives a vast majority of this particular challenge. In California, 60% of our carbon emissions come from transportation. And quite frankly, it is the fastest growing source of emissions globally. So even as we move towards more efficient industry and we can transition utilities towards renewables, the final stumbling block will be transportation. It will come up to consume more and more of the challenge. Okay, I'm not done with the bar graphs and the pie charts. They go on and on, so excuse me for that. This one is particularly interesting, but pretty complex. On the bottom axis is global population. We're at about 6.5 billion now. By income group. So the first bar is the lower quartile, the second is the lower, middle, third, and the fourth quartiles. And believe it or not, this is done by the World Bank according to GDP per capita. So the lower half, the blue bar and the purple bar, represent that part of the world that lives on less than $4,000 a year per capita GDP. We are around $55,000 per capita GDP. So by any stretch of the imagination, we're in that last bar. Okay, on the vertical axis is carbon emissions per capita. So if you have population and carbon emissions per capita, the area of these rectangles represent the total, which is now 32 billion tons of carbon per year. This is our problem. This is the thing that we're stalking. And you can see here the global average that it's really the upper income, the 2 quantiles above, that are the source of the vast majority, 86%. For fun, because I love to draw scenarios, I did a scenario where the planet got to where the IPCC, which is the UN's entity saying we got to keep it under 2 degrees and our carbon emissions have to be by 2050 around 16 billion tons. I know there's more data than you want, but the end result is interesting. Low moderate is the biggest population cohort to grow in the next 40 years. This represents people moving from rural poverty, which is really down there, under $1,000 per capita per person, into the low mid, which is maybe $3,000 or $4,000 a year, which actually represents to many people on this planet a huge advancement. My theory was they don't have to do anything about climate change. They're already operating at a very low level, 1.5 tons per capita. To get to where we need to go, the upper middle has to go to 2 tons per capita, and the wealthy have to come down from to 3.5. Now you can say, well, geez, this is way more than we want. It's going to destroy our economy. There's all sorts of doomsdaying, and a lot of people basically think it's just not possible. The interesting thing about that is right now Sweden is at 4.8 per capita. The wealthier than we are. And cold climate, so there is a country that is already close to our target of 3.5. California today is 10 per capita, but we have a plan, AB 32, that's going to get us to 3.3. And we have it all mapped out, and we have it all legislated. And if you go in, this plan has been in place for 6 years, I believe now. And the economy of California is not diminished by this transition. If anything, it's invigorated. So also we had a tax on the rich that didn't seem to drive businesses out of town. But that's a different debate, just trying to be a little provocative here. So is 3.5 realistic? It's totally realistic, but it has to do with the way we live. It's not just the technology we adopt. So I think it's all about cities. Well, what's happening in cities? This is kind of an amazing thing. For the first time, as population grows on the planet, the rural population has peaked and is going to drop off. So just under 3.5 billion people living in the countryside, most in poverty, is beginning to fall off. The wealthy, developed region cities, the urban environments, will increase, but not dramatically, because we've reached a homeostasis in terms of population growth. Many developed countries have a problem that they don't have replacement level populations, and they need immigration in order to have their economy continue to thrive. We're lucky enough to have immigration to drive us forward into a stronger economy. But it's not the most significant. It's very significant because it's where the wealthy are, and they're the ones who have to change the most, but in terms of numbers. But then look at that bar for less developed regions. That's the urban population. There's the rural population and 2 bars for urban, and then the red one, which goes up to 4.5 billion. There's tremendous growth in those developing world cities, the megacities, the ones that when we think about them, our head explodes. I mean, when you think about how Delhi is growing and the amount of poverty and the amount of challenges there, it's kind of astounding. And yet, that growth is a huge opportunity. That growth is an opportunity for us to get it right. And it turns out that the same strategies that work here on those same challenges actually work the globe out, and I'll try to show that. This is a map of the world proportional to poverty. So each country's boundaries have been stretched to show where poverty is on the planet. So my thesis is that there are 3 types of sprawl, and they're all related around the globe. And I know it's a gross generalization, and yet I've worked everywhere, and things actually fall into these categories. There's low-density sprawl, which is what we have here in the United States and North Canada and Australia, a few special places that largely grew after World War II. The second one is high-density sprawl. This is China building what we thought was a clever idea for urban renewal, super blocks with towers sitting in them, and of course, which led us to Puat-Igo and having to blow those places up. They're now doing it at scale throughout the whole country. Density does not equal urbanism. Urbanism is about mix, walkability, human scale, diversity. It has nothing to do, actually, with density. You can have a low-density town, and it can be great urbanism because people can walk from here to there, and they have a mix. So that's a very special type, but important because China is going to grow their cities by 350 million people in the next 20 years. They're basically going to build enough cities for everybody in the United States in the next 20 years. If they get it wrong, if the DNA of those cities is wrong, we're going to have a very difficult time digging ourselves out from the global environmental challenge that represents. And we share that. Finally, the third type of sprawl, which is ubiquitous in Latin America, Africa, India, and parts of Asia, I call low-income sprawl. This is the phenomena actually we're beginning to see in the United States, where the low-income population is pushed to the periphery, the least desirable location in the metropolitan area. Now, this historically was always the case. The wealthy always loved to be in the center, because that's where all the economic activity and the cultural opportunity and the wealth of the city was at the center. We just had this small aberration where we decided that the wealthy should go away from the city. And it was heavily subsidized, and we know all about that. But most of the world is still struggling with the problem that the poor are at the periphery. And as the poor move from the countryside to cities, that is their biggest economic opportunity. They can move someplace where there are clinics, where there are schools, where there's economic opportunity. And you may look at a favela or a slum and think that this is horrible, but the reality is it's a choice that people are making all over the planet because it is better than where they came from. So the challenge is, how do we make those places more integrated so that they can actually fulfill the potential, which is all those people moving to cities want to become productive, want to become part of a vital economy, want to have decent services and have their kids educated. They want everything we want. And so how can we shape cities for that to happen? So I'm going to take them one at a time, and I'm going to start with, and Mexico is just an example. Each one of these is an example. So in Mexico, they had a public policy that was really powerful for the last 8 years, was to build social housing at the periphery. They had a lot of informal housing. The informal housing is down below, and the social housing or the subsidized housing is above, both in bad locations, because all the good locations are taken by wealthy and have high land values. There's some exceptions in Rio and places like that where the favelas literally got in there early and sit close to the center, but the norm is that these are pushed to the periphery where people pay a huge penalty in accessibility, just transportation time, and I'll talk more about that. One of the cool things actually is that the informal settlements are really much more interesting urban places. They're mixed use, people work at home, they build their houses as they need it, so they add a bedroom when they get a kid. They have the opportunity for sweat equity. In many ways, they're much better than public housing. And certainly better than what's going on in, they don't look great, but they function wonderfully. Their problem, they don't own, is land tenure, so they can never capitalize the value of everything they've created. They can never take out a mortgage and get some cash to send their kid to school based on that ownership. And they don't have decent public services, sewer, water, and things like that. So actually, you can look at that lower slide and think to yourself, this could be a great model. All we need to do is add tenure, land security, and infrastructure. Lots of interesting issues. Now, this is the state of the world everywhere. Every city across the planet, another common. But what's fascinating is that this is pictures of Mexico City where only 30% of households own cars. 70% of the people don't have a car, and they're at gridlock. Now, it's a denser city, and it has a very special form of transit called colectivos, which I used to romanticize, all the informal transit systems that you see in much of the world. But the reality is, it doesn't work. They are privately operated, they're dirty, they stop anywhere to pick up anybody, because every time they pick somebody up, they earn a fare. And they drop them off anywhere because they want them to come back, and they run very short routes. And so in a city where the low-income population is distant, those people have to take 3, 4, 5 different buses to get to the work. There's easily people running from an hour and a half normative to 3 hours each direction to get to and from work. So this is an urban design problem. This is an infrastructure problem. So here's the data. This is where the wealthy live, all in the center of Mexico City, growing outward, the inner ring, which hasn't grown. This is DF, which is the city, and then this is the suburbs. That's the way that works there. This is where the jobs are. Amazing that there's a coincidence between the two. So we felt, when we went there to do a regional plan using urban footprint, we had to actually recalibrate the whole machine and map the city in a way that made the salient issues come forward. So we decided to map it on 2 axes. One was proximity, which is how do people get around? Well, there's a zone here, number 3, where so there's job proximity and transit proximity. If if you're next to one of those, then you can actually map where you are living. And so there's 4 different combinations of those. So you could actually be in a place here where you have, oops, I went forward one. Here where you have the best of both worlds. Well, that happens to be where the wealthy are. Along this yellow line is their metro line. You have good proximity to transit but not jobs. Over here, you have proximity to jobs but no good transit. And then the rest, 2/3 of the population, has none of the above. None of the above. And so this is, once again, an urban design challenge. Now take those 4 place types and combine them with urban types. And one is walkability, the scale of the street grid. The other one is density. And it turns out that the vast majority, 58% of the city, has decent urbanism, the kind of stuff that we always advocate. And that's because, with 70% of the people without cars, they have to live in walkable neighborhoods. It's a fait accompli, unless the government comes down and gives them housing in the wrong format, in the wrong place, with the wrong mix, which is the few places where the urbanism doesn't happen because of government intervention. So let's get really complicated. Here's 16 place types, but that's not good enough because each place type would function a different way for a different income group, because people's behavior is affected by their income. So 3 income groups, 48 typologies. So we mapped the city based on these 48 types, and then we created scenarios using those as the building blocks. So much of this, so much of that. What kind of future can we get? And we studied it across that whole spectrum of benefits. This wasn't about carbon. Actually, in most of the world, just like in parts of the United States, people don't care about carbon, and they're not willing to focus on climate change because it's just too painful and challenging. They're concerned with air quality, earning a living, getting their kids through school, but these are all urban challenges, and when we solve all of them, we solve climate change as a bonus, is the way I look at it. So you have to measure all the co-benefits that come with good urbanism. We shape these scenarios. I won't go into any great detail, but the trend is always the baseline. What if they just keep doing what they're doing? What happens there? And then, these are romantic names, moderate and vision. But they cut across whether or not the city focuses on infill versus new expansion, whether the jobs are decentralized in ways that they become accessible to the poor, whether transport shifts from informal transit to more formal BRT and metro, and the urban configuration. So we had this whole complicated thing. It gets amazingly complicated, but it makes a big difference because the people that are engaged in this process care about the outcome. They see their scenario on the table. They see the reality of their city revealed to them, kind of stripped back. Instead of looking at a land use map or a figure ground drawing or something like that, they actually look at the socio-economic urban accessibility map. And then they see all the metrics. Now, one thing that we never measure in the United States is transit travel time, because we're concerned with VMT. How much are people driving their car? And that leads to congestion and costs and environmental impacts and all the rest of that. There, one of the prime issues was, well, how long does it take somebody in the lower income groups to get to work if they're lucky enough to have a job? And so we have a metric there, travel time, which shows improvements based on this plan. So a lot of people look at a place like Mexico City, 9 million in population, and wonder how they can get their arms around it. And yet, this study showed very simply that there were many action items that they're now trying to engage. First is they need more formal transit systems, more BRT lines. Second is they need to decentralize jobs. And third is they need to shift their housing policy from being remote to being infill and being single income isolated to being mixed income neighborhoods. Fairly straightforward stuff with now a powerful coalition behind it. Now, China is a completely different thing, but it's funny to me that all these things have their genesis in a really flawed planning theology, of single-use zoning, and that cars and technology will solve all problems. We have arterial grids in the United States at about 1 mile on center, and then the other streets don't go through. So all the cars are pushed to the arterials, and of course the arterials are not the kind of place you want to hang around because of that. In China, it's every quarter mile. There is a road, period. No other through roads. These are enclaves within these quarter mile sections. There's up to 5,000 units of housing in each one of these super blocks. And they evolved from, I'll talk about later, but they are single use, and the environment, the moment you step out of the super block, is unviable for pedestrians and bikes. Of course, what do you have? You have the worst air quality in the world, not unlike Mexico City. In Beijing, you have gridlock that's legend. everywhere. And once again, Beijing is now 34% auto ownership. So once again, you're living in cities where most people don't have cars, and yet cars dominate every public right-of-way and make the city uninhabitable. Now, is that equitable? Is that reasonable? Or is that even functional? You have to ask the question. It's a radical question, the idea of streets without cars. Who could have ever proposed such a thing? And yet, if the vast majority of people don't have cars, maybe that does begin to make sense. Beijing went from being a bicycle city to the death of bicyclists. I mean, the fatality, the pedestrian and bike fatalities across China now are extraordinary. And air quality impact now, this is a study by the New Market Economy that showed almost 12% of GDP, it can be absorbed by the cost of air quality impacts. So these things are not free. You might see them as a health issue or something like that. But the reality is these things cost the economy. They weigh down economies. They stop our growth. And as I was mentioning, it comes from this perverse vision of towers in the park. You know, this is Corbusier drawing in the 30s where all the freeways are free-flowing and all the cities, all the buildings sit in parks. And we have these guys experimenting once again with what was a failed concept that we went into. And Brasilia is built. I mean, it's been built too many places. Their idea is that they can just build streets big enough. And because they have this huge infrastructure capacity, they build it. But I was interested in the Strong Towns lecture earlier today. If any of you saw that, I thought it was very good, because the reality is this is the same thing. Cities are building these massive pieces of infrastructure that really will not be sustainable over time. And then, of course, it's tragic because they come from a city life that really was about human scale and community interaction, small businesses, selling fresh goods, everything that we think would be great to have in our cities, they used to have, and they're extracting it at a rapid rate. Feng Shui says that all buildings face south. As a passive solar designer, you might think that's okay, but there does come a point where too much of a good thing is not a good thing. We did analysis. This is not all just aesthetically bound. And the analysis looked at, in the city of Jinan, we did travel surveys in the old traditional core, where it was built out of the historic Chinese fabric, the grid part of the city, which was turn-of-the-century European imposed, nice 300-foot city blocks, the way city blocks should be. The fourth one is the interesting one. It's the Soviet enclave. This is where the superblock was imported into China from the Soviet Union. But in those days, each superblock was a complete community, had its own factories, schools, nurseries, housing, everything. People just lived within the superblock, and that was the enclave. And then, of course, now the modern superblock. And the auto VK, vehicle kilometers driven, you can see here, 5 times higher in the single-use superblock area. You know, just devastating. This looks like a bad, a biased rendering of what they built, but actually it's an accurate rendering of one of the new towns outside of Kunming, housing on superblock. This is my experiment with taking exactly the same quantity of streets and exactly the same quantity of buildings and transforming it into a different urban pattern. So you can go from this to this without spending anything more and without losing any development capacity on the land. So let me show you how this has played out. We've been sponsored by an amazing group, the Energy Foundation, who has a huge program in China to basically do demonstration projects throughout China and then transition from the demonstrations to national policy. These are the steps we take when we do the planning in China. Where is the best location for development, and the environmental factors come into play there. Focus density around transit station, the idea of TOD being the armature, the transit system, the armature of growth, not the highway system. A walkable street grid comes next, and then mixed-use zoning. Simple. So this is a small study area for 4.5 million people in the city of Chongqing, which is 30 million people in one city. So we start logically with the natural landscape, which is something that actually the planning profession there hasn't been accustomed to doing. Just like our model in Southern California, mass grading and ignoring the natural environment is tragically the norm. Show the areas that need to be preserved, show the existing development. There are highways and there will always be highways. These are the TOD districts, the areas that can be coherent from a pedestrian and bike standpoint. This is the metro system. The beauty of China is they have the right ingredients. They're willing to invest in transit, and they have density. They can build great cities. They just have to get the right DNA. And so the next step is to show how development focuses through here. So wherever metro lines intersect, there's much more capacity. That's where it's logical to have an urban center or a town center or a regional sub-center. And the secondary places have secondary. There's a logic to how the land use is created, and the logic is driven by transit. There is a logic to sprawl. I mean, and it is driven by freeways. Whenever you have two freeways intersecting, you'll have a mall. I mean, this is kind of the way it works. So to drill down, just to give you a sense of scale, this area here, they asked us to do a detailed design, and this is the overall scheme. The existing plan there was super blocks, isolated uses. This was commercial and this was residential, and they were quite large block schema. This area, Chongqing, is very, very hilly, and so we shaped what is a fine-grained grid around that topography, just to demonstrate that you could do it on something other than flat ground. And then, of course, mixed use, small block throughout, walkable. This is the topography and how we preserve the steep slopes and the river banks. That's actually what the site looked like before. This is what it'll look like after. It was a huge lift to convince them not to build on the waterfront, not to build on the riverfront. It was too steep to build on as far as I was concerned, but they were quite happy to do that. So this is just a plan of that green infrastructure. Now, the other thing that's embedded in here are auto-free streets. So every one of these highlighted streets with trees are actually auto-free streets. So the idea that you don't need automobiles on every street starts to become accepted in this part of the world. These are actually a diagram of those auto-free streets. Some of these streets lead up very steep hills. And so instead of just having sidewalks, we actually plan to have, just as they have in Hong Kong, escalators. Now, this is a radical idea. We're willing to spend millions of dollars on an interchange, but the idea of spending money on pedestrians seems to be abnormal, even when they dominate the population, even when the majority of the population doesn't own a car. And so actually the truth of the matter is it's all been an easy sell. Everything that I've shown you is now embraced across China because they understand. I mean, we do show them pictures of Puat-Igo getting blown up and saying that you are building the slums of the future. And they're actually very quick, very smart, and they're very fact-based. And so by showing the analysis, they get it, and they also get the fact that people really don't want to live that way. And so this is the metro center with a park and one-way streets and the mix of uses and the street network. I won't go into all the detail of this, but it's quite a revolution for them to shift from a pattern that they've been building at normal for 30 years. Now, I explain the small block as a variation on the traditional element in the Chinese urban environment, which is the courtyard. The courtyard of the Hutang, which is the traditional house or the palace or the temple, they were all built around courtyards. And so the small city block with an interior courtyard that is secure and with a perimeter that's lined with shops and local activities, it becomes the building block of a healthy city. That's the interior of one. Now, let's see where I am in time-wise. I better just zoom through this because we have this methodology of how you transition from a super block to a healthy grid, and you just look at using one-way streets, which are really ubiquitous. I know the new urbanists hate them. Actually, I've been expelled from the Congress for New Urbanism for doing all this work. Number one, I'm building high-rise buildings, and that's verboten. And number two, I love one-way streets, which is also verboten. So, but just show me how Portland would work without one-way streets. Show me how Manhattan would work without one-way streets on the east-west streets. You get human-scale streets that are actually safe to cross because you only have to worry about cars coming at you in one direction. Instead of a 6 or 8 lane boulevard, you can have a 3-lane straight here and a 3-lane street here, both of which are pedestrian, easy to cross. And yeah, you have to make sure people don't speed too much, but they really do function. That's the way high-density cities work. And then, of course, this even more radical idea that there can be all sorts of streets without cars. This is one in a project in Zhuhai that's just south of Hong Kong. And this is a light rail street with a bikeway, pedestrian, and shops. Now, we can't do that here in the United States. And because there were, back in the 60s, there were all these failed Main Street malls. We tried to fix our main streets by taking cars away, but we're still too much of an auto culture to make that happen. But in the rest of the world that hasn't become auto-based cultures, they can do this all day and all night, and it makes sense. And all of a sudden, it creates environments where perhaps everybody doesn't dream of having a car as the next step. And then, of course, we can put together all the best practices in terms of ecological design for these pedestrian bike environments. Transit boulevards should be part of the lexicon of how we build cities. Here's another one, Chongqing. This is actually where I got that model of the super block and the housing. You go inside these things and it's frightening. Here it is, high density, as dense as Manhattan. There isn't a sidewalk and there is not a store anywhere. There's nothing going on the ground plane. And, you know, so I think that when they begin, and then in the next super block over, I found this and it was just astounding. They had spontaneously, illegally, and they do illegal things in China. We think of, you know, the stereotype is that everybody's oppressed. That's not the case. They converted garages into small shops, and they took a driveway and turned it into a walking street. And they did this without the planner's help. This was not intended to be this way. We went from this grid to this grid, and instead of having major arterials running through the center, all these green streets are one-way streets that are easy for pedestrians to cross. These are the auto-free streets that network through it. This is a view of the central spine street. This is these double axis of park blocks. I still copy Portland's park blocks. I measure them, you know, very exactly, and I put them in all my projects. But the idea that you would have a series of parks instead of an 8-lane boulevard seemed to me really a powerful idea. So that's what that is. Chenang, which is the big boulevard that runs through Beijing, is 12 lanes at grade, 12 lanes. Even if you're going crossing the street underground, you have to stop and rest before you can get to the other side. And then on top of the 12 lanes, they add these ginormous setbacks. So getting building to building is crazy. So what we did in this one was we said, no, what was ironic is that they had already put 80 meters of space for this big central boulevard because everybody copies Beijing. We converted it into these parks with transit lines on either side, and we put all the traffic on these side streets. This is really just what Jaime Lerner at Curitiba did many years ago. But it's not all new towns. It's also re-inhabiting, rebuilding. This is a beautiful historic district in downtown Gangsha that's going to get a metro line through the middle, and therefore we'll get a 60-meter swath of ground that the metro goes under, cut through it. And there's a lot of dilapidated buildings. But right through the center of it is another one of these great streets where the community comes together, where affordable shopping happens and local businesses are supported. And that was going to be wiped out and turned into this, another 6-lane arterial. So we propose that they keep that right-of-way where the metro line runs and use it as a pedestrian way, and yes, of course, use one-way streets to divert traffic around that so that this whole thing becomes a nice pedestrian-friendly place. And then infill, along with the new buildings, these little shops so that small businesses have a chance again. And since it's sitting on the public right-of-way, the public sector gets to, 45. I haven't even gotten to America. Maybe I'll skip America. This is Is that okay? Not all right. Anyway, so we developed these design standards that are now being adopted at the national level. The NDRC, which allocates all major infrastructure dollars around China, has now accepted a TOD set of guidelines. So whenever they build transit within 800 meters of a major transit station, they have to follow our guidelines, which is kind of a big win. But we also wrote these other guidelines, which are, I realized after doing them, and I did them for China, that they are universal. And this goes back to my original postulate, that our challenges are common and a lot of our solutions are common. We tend to always focus on the differences and how unique a place is, and we never want to stop doing that because uniqueness is what makes identity and a sense of place. And yet there are fundamental things that are universal. One of them is walking. If you can't walk in a city, it's not a city. Don't call it a city, don't call it urban, don't call it a town. You're lying. Second is, bicycles are the most efficient form of transportation. Give them some space. The idea that we line our streets with dead cars, parked cars, instead of giving our space to bikes is, I know it's a huge challenge, it's a psychological shift, but there are many parts, Copenhagen is one good example, where they are dominated by bike users, and they're wealthy. It's not just for poor people, it's not just for Chinese. The street network is fundamental. It's the DNA of a city. We firebombed most of Japan, and all the buildings are new, but for Kyoto, if you've ever been there. But the street network remains. It's like indelible. It's the right-of-ways. Once you establish the right-of-ways, that grain and that texture and that identity and quirkiness remains. And so that has to be gotten right. Mixed use. I don't need to say anything. These are all universal principles. These apply here in Baton Rouge just as well as in Beijing. High-quality transit. We have to do it. There is no future in the world for the automobile city. As that, once again, I was very impressed with his talk. What was his name on Strong Cities? Chuck, if you're in the audience, I praise you. You get it right. We have to build in a traditional way, and traditional ways use transit. We can't dedicate everything to the car. The idea that transit shapes the city is a radical one, but it's one that I think is universal. And that when there is expansion, we need deep connections. And I talked earlier today about high-speed rail and how it works. And then, after you've done all that, after you've gotten the urbanism right, then let's put the best practice for renewables and conservation and building design. Not instead of, but on as well. So, now let me quickly go through U.S. You know this. I bet you know what I'd say about that. You know what I'd say about that. Now, some of you who are in the talk this morning already know what I say about this, which is Vision California, but it's a powerful use of a tool we developed for the state of California, which is Urban Footprint, which collects data. So people can't make the right decisions if they don't, first of all, know where they are. Somebody, John, you guys mentioned, gee, they didn't even know where the vacant lots were. You have to get the data in place. And we have, one of the gifts of this moment in human history is we are data rich and we can manipulate it and use it. So we got to get to work on that. So data organization and getting a database that's uniform so that cities can actually talk to each other, use the same zoning language. This is fundamental. The second is the scenario process. It's what we did here. It's what we've been doing for years. You have to let people come together, roll up their sleeves, and paint different pictures of the future and play out their version of the future. And only in so doing can they actually accept and join with other special interest groups to shape scenarios, and then let the scenarios be analyzed, but not on one metric, on many metrics, and therefore people come to conclusions. So these are 3 place types. We used a simplistic version for the state of California. They all exist in my town, San Ramon, Rockridge, San Francisco. Sprawl, absolutely typical. Rockridge, a historic streetcar suburb, low-rise, mixed-use, walkable. San Francisco, one of the least dense cities on the planet, but a great piece of urbanism. And here are the numbers. The density, the land consumption varies greatly. The carbon emissions, 3 to 1. The VMT, this is the big one. 30,000 miles average out in the suburbs versus 7,000 miles in the city. We can fix what we've got going by just building more places like Rockridge and San Francisco, and that is the challenge we have. So let's say we built a future for the state, 70% sprawl versus one that was 55% Rockridge, not putting people in cities, putting people into small towns. And I won't go into all this, but the greenhouse gas emissions comes way down, as you would expect. Land consumption. Now, this is a set of special interest group, whether they're environmentalists or farmers, that all of a sudden see their metric on the table as a prime outcome of a big choice. And they can join hands with urban advocates, social justice people, infrastructure costs. This was gone into today. So the new cost, whoever pays for it, the O&M cost, which was discussed earlier today, and the revenues. And you put all those three numbers together, and all of a sudden you discover the way towns can exist in the future is through smart growth, not through more sprawl. They can't afford it. And this clearly demonstrates it. The VMT changes, which has a huge impact on lifestyles. How much time people spend in cars, we now know, is very related to health. This is just a map of the Los Angeles region by VMT per household. Building energy changes, and that's utility costs for people. It's not just carbon and new power stations. Water, one of the biggest issues that we have in California, changes dramatically. This is all just comparing business as usual to a smart growth scenario that leans most heavily on small town design, 2-, 3-story environments. Respiratory health related to air quality, activity related, obesity and diabetes, all connected, all interconnected. Household costs. We did this actually closer to the '08 crash, and so the issue of what drove people out of those homes. And I don't think it was all just perverse lending. It was that actually we built too much of the wrong stuff. And in order to move it off the shelf, as it were, it had to get discounted. It had to have special deals, special mortgages, because people truly couldn't afford it. When you add together the mortgage and the travel cost, which is easily 30 to 40% of household expenses, when we add those two things together, is unaffordable to the American middle class and, quite frankly, undesirable to the new demographics. And so this question of what is the more affordable future really has meaning and resonance. You can say, well, we're going to get back to being completely, wealthy enough to drive too far and live on a cul-de-sac. Or you could say, well, we actually don't have to get that wealthy. We can live really good lives in small towns and transit-oriented development. So all this, and I'm not going to go through all this. This is just craziness here. This is my obsession. Sorry. Excuse that. But it's all about the fact that you can only get to these changes through consensus, and you can only get to consensus through coalitions. And the multi-metric analysis and the scenario process is what actually drives that. After 30 years of doing this and kind of doing it one project at a time or one program at a time, I'm absolutely convinced now that the way forward is to give everybody the right tool and let them do it themselves. Develop the right methodology and let every town go through the process of scenario building and multi-metric analysis. Now, there's a lot of good news around the U.S. People are coming back to the city. This is downtown Oakland before and after. They call it gentrification, but actually I call it mixed income. And I'm getting very tired of gentrification getting a bad rap. There are many communities that would love to have a broader mix of household incomes, and with that comes more services, better schools, more shops, a whole range of things. And there's data out there that shows that the displacement is not nearly as draconian as it's always portrayed to be. There's trade-offs in everything. You can't do anything in life without a trade-off. So the question is, what's the right balance? But bringing people back to downtown Oakland, traditionally a low-income community, and having them be a different income group, a different age group, that's good in my book. Right along University, this is a crime map. This is where all the crime in Berkeley was on University Avenue, the Grand Boulevard to one of the great universities. And it was because that's what it looked like up above here. And now this is what it looks like as we build out mixed use. And our old industrial zones can convert. This is a part of San Jose that was industrial, converted into mixed use. That was what it used to look like, and this is what it looks like now. So these are all just more than feel good. They're signs of the time, that times are changing in terms of how development happens. Now, this is the biggest change. LA, in 2008, in the middle of the recession, voted in a $40 billion bond initiative for transit. They are spending 100% of their RTP, which is the money they have for transportation in the region, on repair, maintenance, and transit. Zero for new roads. Zero. This is the auto city that led the world into that fantasy of the convertible and the palm trees on the boulevard. And so if LA can do it, anybody can do it. This is the map of what they're doing. That's the light rail system, tiny. Those are the extensions. This is the extensive commute train system and their extensions. And this is the new BRT system, which is going to grid the whole historic core of LA. And then, most importantly, that's the high-speed rail. High-speed rail isn't just about moving from one city to the next. In major metropolitan areas, it's actually about weaving the whole region together, because LA is actually too big for a single metro line, light rail line, too big for BRT. And so it actually gets 12 high-speed rail stations, and it will, as a standalone facility, make sense, but I won't go more. So somebody asked me earlier today, well, what about the suburbs? This is what you do with the suburbs. You take this underutilized boulevard, which is ubiquitous in LA, you put in transit, you put in amenities, and you zone for mixed use. That's what you do. Simple, and by the way, the marketplace is there for it, the development community wants it to happen. I'm going to skip. Too much. I know this, you know. But I will stop on this one. This one is great. So this is my biggest frustration, and I think my best work in the last number of years. In Redwood City, the heart of Silicon Valley, there's a 1,000-acre site. It sits, we did a regional plan for the Bay Area, so I understood this. The red zones are job-rich. This is where all the jobs are. No mystery there. That's Silicon Valley and San Francisco. And the green are housing-rich. So this is where people live who are poor. This is where people go to work. There's a disconnect. And actually, the yellow zones are balanced jobs, housing. But basically, you have this huge imbalance. And so we need more housing on the peninsula. This is a site here, old salt works, that's surrounded by 300,000 jobs. This is a region that won't stop building jobs, but won't build housing to match. So a lot of people say, well, what about affordable housing? What about gentrification? What about the cost of living? Well, the fault is that we don't build enough housing. And there's a very simple formula. It's not like you have to build any amount. You have to build the amount that the number of jobs demand. I mean, for every job, there's a person. And for every person, mostly, except for the homeless, there's a house somewhere. The question is, how far away is that house? What option does that person have to get there? Do they have to cross one of 3 bridges in a constrained area like this? That's the question. So jobs housing is the key. Here's a site that is surrounded by jobs itself, 30,000 jobs, and is directly adjacent to Redwood City, which will have a high-speed rail station. So our design took only about 40% of the land and built all high density, no single family at all. And then, I think I have slides in here, took the open space and this is like a miniature version of a Louisiana Speaks plan, which is if you do the habitat restoration, because these are salt flats, they have no ecology, no life, nothing going on there. So you rebuild that. Then you have a parkland that's a complex ecology that invites people back to the water's edge. And then you have drainage ways that are the ecological system fingers, as it were, that went into the neighborhoods that functioned very much for drainage and storm retention. This is a floodplain area that needs a levee. And so we have, and then you put in a lot of amenities that the city is missing. And so all of a sudden you have a ratio here of 800 acres of open space and 600 of development. The developer, like they used to do in the old days, in streetcar suburbs, those streetcars were built by developers. The developer who wanted to make his land accessible would pay for the streetcar. Here, the developer, 15,000 units, will pay for a streetcar that connects to downtown Redwood City and light rail. Moreover, there are levees that have to be built around the whole bay. I think you guys know something about this issue. And so why not let the development pay for the levees? Why should they be a general tax overall, especially when you can extract that? But the idea here was that that levee became a park, not just a pile of riprap, not just a barrier, but also an ecological space. And so this whole hierarchy of places, did I leave out the best slide? I did. Anyway, so that's a project that hasn't been approved. Jobs, housing, transit, open space, wetlands restoration, levees, everything that we need but can't happen because of lack of consensus about building new communities. Very frightening for people. So I leave you with that, maybe a little less optimistic. And I come back, of course, to what we did here, which I think was an extraordinary opportunity for us. John and I were proud to be able to work on this. But it was one of those moments where, boy, our eyes got opened to, every place opens your eyes. That's the amazing thing. No matter where you go, if you look, you'll see amazing opportunities and amazing challenges. And it's the intersection of those. And I remember this slide most of all, this idea that you had to do all these things simultaneously. And I think that's a global imperative too. So I know I've taken you far afield from the business at hand, but I think it's important for everybody to recognize that there's a commonality here, and the solutions you come up with will be looked at and used around the planet. And hopefully some of the solutions that are happening elsewhere you can inherit and use. And it's the cross-fertilization that makes, I think, for an optimistic future for mankind. I'm still optimistic. Sometimes. Thank you. Yeah? Did I talk too long?
It was perfect. We wanted to go, but I do want to ask you to address one.
We don't get to sit in these beautiful chairs?
Well, if you want to, but it's only 5 minutes.
All right.
You talk about the notion of stranded assets in your book.
Yeah.
And stranded assets are assets that Peter sees as areas that if we rebuilt for tomorrow, might not build there in the first place. And this is very relevant in Louisiana, especially as it relates to sea level rise and flooding exposure that a lot of our low-lying communities are experiencing. So my question to you is, can you talk a little bit about stranded assets?
Wow.
How we deal with that here in Louisiana?
Well, it's a huge issue. I mean, it ranges from all the investments in oil extraction, and those may be stranded assets if demand continues to be mitigated and go down. But, you know, on some level, people make investments in things, and there should be no guarantee, and certainly the government shouldn't guarantee return on investment. I mean, we did too much of that in 2008. The idea that government should bail out bad choices, I think the economists call it moral hazard, and I believe it's a conservative concept, which is the marketplace, with all of its invisible hand wisdom, has to work its ways. And when people make mistakes, they end up having to pay. And it's a painful experience, and they spend a lot of money on lobbyists to avoid the experience. So that's, you know, that's kind of one dimension of stranded assets, and I have in my head all the carbon resources below the Earth's surface that, if we are to survive, really will not be extracted. And yet they're on the balance sheets of so many major companies. And there's an argument to be made, just like all that housing in the wrong place at the wrong scale. By the way, do you realize that when we were really, I mean, we were the model for the world in the 50s and 60s. The average home was 1,100 square feet. That's when the American dream took over the whole world. We were 1,100. We're 2,300 square foot per household now. And the household population has dropped. There are fewer people per household. So you have to wonder what's appropriate, what's necessary. So Are all those big houses on cul-de-sacs stranded assets? They may be, and they already have lost their value. And that's what the marketplace does. It's ruthless about saying bad choices lead to bad economic outcomes. Now, people chose to live in lowlands in Louisiana, and I think that it's an incredibly difficult proposition. I don't have a simple answer for that, the kind of pain, other than to say that maybe the answer is slowness. Slowness. There was something too abrupt about the people who showed up after the hurricanes and started telling people in the Ninth Ward that they needed to move because it wasn't a good place for a neighborhood. That's just too abrupt. It's not appropriate. People have family history and emotions and memories and things like that. So I think slowness is probably the best answer. It has to change. The rate of change has to be sensitive to a lot of variables. And if you can afford it, slow change is always better. And as a matter of fact, the same is true with building cities. Incremental, step-by-step, small events, they build the richest, best cities. The big master plans that I draw, I'm lucky if I can touch the toenails of something that evolved organically based on the right principles. I won't stop doing it because if I don't do it, somebody else is going to do it. But I know that the best thing is small, slow, and incremental. And I think in solving those things, I think what needs to happen is slowly over time, the real costs, the real insurance rates need to be put into place. Slowly over time, those costs have to be realized, and people need to make private decisions about when and how to move. That's the only thing I can think of. Now, the big oil companies with their stranded assets, my attitude, let them go down right away. Okay, thank you.
Before you leave, I would like to put the last slide up and tell you to thank Peter with me again as the co-author of Louisiana Speaks Regional Plan, along with John Fregonese. Would you stand, John? We want to thank you for all you gave to Louisiana. And Urban Design Associates out of Pittsburgh also did all of our pattern books. We have a toolkit out there for your wonderful use. Eric Ost represents UD up there, Urban Design Associates, and Ray Gendros. And so we also have a few Louisiana Speaks champions, and that group I'll talk a little bit about tomorrow. But they were the real citizen leaders that stood up after Katrina and Rita and said, if this plan really is going to be the plan for tomorrow, for the next 25 years for Louisiana, we want to examine every part of it and make sure it does. Those were the Louisiana Speaks champions. Some are in this room. I want to thank them again. I'd like to now invite you to come and have a nice drink and some wonderful hors d'oeuvres with us in the second floor gallery. And we are going to recognize a very special place tonight in our Great Places Award. So please come upstairs and have some wine and beer and fun. Thank you.